So, good, good evening, Mr. or Pak Hersen Kerajaan. Okay, today my name is Vera Barabarit. I'm a junior researcher at Research Center for Law, and then I'm today as Master of Ceremony, and then we want to talk about climate ocean under the topic climate change and small scale fisheries. Uh, we have Miss Julia Nakamura. Uh, she is consultant of the Development Law Service, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And then so we have Miss Dr. Sanya Fabrica, Knowledge Exchange Associate University of Strathclyde, UK. And then we have Mr. Herson Kerajaan as Rector of Universitas Halmahera. Nice to meet you all. And then the moderator is Miss Laili Nuridaya. She is also head of Research Center for Law, National Research and Innovation Agency. Maybe Miss Laili Hidayah, you can begin the discussion, and then time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbak Vera. Good afternoon, everyone here in Jakarta, and good morning to panelists Julia and Mbak Senia in UK. We are very privileged to have distinguished panelists and speaker. Mbak Senia, I know long time ago we are from the same alumni, United Nations Nippon Fellowship Law of the Sea. Even we are not the same batch, but we met during the alumni meeting several times in Bali and then in Japan. In Japan, right, Mbak Senia? Yeah, and then we are also privileged to have Julia Nakamura. I think she is have so much expertise on climate change and small scale fisheries. This is the topic that we are talk and discuss today: climate change and small scale fisheries. She's consultant of Development Law Service at Food and Agriculture Organization of FAO, and also the PhD researcher at One Hub, the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance, University of Strathclyde. And then Pa Herson is from University of Halmahera, Rector of University of Halmahera. So first of all, actually, I would like to introduce the speaker to our Research Center for Law, National Research of Innovation Agency. Research Center for Law is a new research center under Institute of Social and Humanities, National Research and Innovation Agency. So we established this year, 2022, and our researchers come from different ex-ministries, such as from Supreme Court, Mahkamah Agung, and then from General Attorney, from Ministry of Human Rights and Law, and then other ministry, which is now merged into a Research Center for Law. So with your presentation, probably we can have, we can exchange, we can enhance our knowledge, and then broaden our horizon on how is the progress of climate change and small scale fisheries, especially how the international law respond to the climate change and the impact to the small scale fisher, because it is, I think it is very timely, as we also face the climate change, the disruption to the fisheries, and then how this national law, for example, probably Pak Herson or Mbak Senia will talk about Indonesian law, how they is that they already have adequate or effective protection to the impact of small climate change to the small scale fisher, and then how this adaptation probably from local experience, like Pak Herson already conducted the research on Tobelo and Morotai, so we will hear about the local experience, how is the climate change impact the small scale fisher. So without further ado, I would like to invite probably Julia first to have a talk. It's up to you. 20 minutes or more. So it is. We are happy to have, like, probably you have 1 hour and then half hour for discussion. So please.
Thank you very much, Lily, and thank you to the organizers of the event for inviting me. Thank you, Sanya. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let me know if you can see this.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm delighted to be speaking with you and sharing a bit of my research that I've been carrying out on this topic. And I'm going to be speaking about climate change and small-scale fisheries. So in this presentation, I'll give you a general overview first of small-scale fisheries for those who may not be familiar with this topic. And then I'll look in particular to how small-scale fisheries have been addressed in the context of climate change, and then go into the protection of small-scale fisheries human rights in this changing ocean context, and share a bit of the findings of my research and the next steps on what should be done in terms of research. So first of all, looking into small-scale fisheries, it is a subsector within fisheries that, even though it has this small scale in its term, it actually represents a lot of big numbers. So as you can see in the slide, I've highlighted some of the important important characteristics of small-scale fisheries. So they represent about 90% of people dependent on capture fisheries, and half of this number is women. So there are a lot of women involved in small-scale fisheries. They are mostly involved in the pre-harvesting and post-harvesting activities. So not so much in the capture of the fish, but a lot of in the preparation of the tools to fish, mending nets, and also in the post-harvesting, so in the processing and marketing activities. Small-scale fisheries are known to use small fishing boats, and the size of the boats will vary in the countries. They employ low levels of technology and capital investments, and they produce significantly less per unit as compared to a large fishing vessel. Because they are very diverse and dynamic, so every country, and even within the country, there could be even definitions of coming from states and municipalities and local definitions of what small-scale fisheries are. States have not agreed on a single definition of what small-scale fisheries entail. But they are known also to be governed by informal arrangements and customary practices, which may or not be recognized by law. They contribute significantly to the livelihoods of local communities by providing nutritious food, jobs, and occupations. They are also known to maintain and build culture, values, and traditional knowledge, and also known to have this strong resilience and community solidarity, which have helped them face their vulnerabilities, and also particularly in the context of disasters, disasters, and also COVID. For instance, there have been recent studies highlighting how they have overcome these challenges through their resilience and solidarity. So here, this is a snapshot of the findings from a study. It's called Illuminating Hidden Harvest Report that has been prepared by FAO together with World Fish and Duke University. They have been putting together this study to identify the numbers in small-scale fisheries and try to gather the data on how much the small-scale fisheries contribute to harvesting of aquatic foods, supporting livelihoods and jobs, the percentages in the share of governance, as well as the contributions of women to the sector, and the provision of essential nutritions to the communities. So this is a study that is ongoing. The full report is, I believe, it's going to be published by the end of the year. But this is sort of some of the findings that they have already be able to produce, and this was published in the FAO State of the World Fisheries and Aquaculture, which is a report that is released every 2 years in the Committee on Fisheries meeting. It's also important to acknowledge that small-scale fisheries are vulnerable and marginalized by government. So even though they contribute significantly to the livelihoods of local communities, they still face struggles with lack of financial support and lack of recognition of their customary rights, and that hinders their ability to fully enjoy their human rights. They also face challenges with unequal power relations and competition with other sectors. So looking now into small-scale fisheries in the context of climate change, they are facing the challenges due to the fact that with the global decrease in capture fisheries caused by by climate change impacts, there is also the possibility of these impacts having a greater negative impacts on the physical and mental health and well-being of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, such as small-scale fisheries. So that causes and creates food insecurity, less ecosystem services, and also enhances the competition with other sectors for space and fishery resources, and potentially creates greater conflicts in this context. There's also sea level rise impacts extreme weather events and climate-related disasters on coastal environments, which cause, for instance, beach erosion and inundation, and that forces communities to reallocate. They lose their properties, fishery tools, and facilities. Now, this context also offers some opportunities to really incorporate the local ecological knowledge that local communities and small-scale fishing communities have to identify the mechanisms for adaptation to climate change and how to operationalize these mechanisms by ensuring that all relevant actors are participating in and building their capacity to really be resilient against climate change impacts, and also develop climate change policies, strategies, and laws. In these slides, you will see the recent publications that have been released over the recent years on climate change and which are particularly relevant to small-scale fisheries for various reasons. And you can see here the publications that were published by FAO. They highlight efforts to adapt and mitigate climate change, highlighting the importance of these efforts to be human-centered and include measures to eradicate poverty, ensure food security, empower communities, provide alternative livelihoods, and address power imbalances. Also, they inform on good practices and foundational principles of fisheries management recommendations for future directions in the context of climate change. There's also this publication here, which links climate change, disaster risks, and human rights. The importance of mainstreaming climate risk management into development planning and fisheries management. And this publication here also provides some examples of direct climate change impacts on capture fisheries, which also includes those impacts that are facing by small-scale fisheries. And other publication by WWF also highlights some changes and this is based on empirical work that they have done in some countries, looking into changes in fishing activities and practices observed locally by the stakeholders. So how they've seen the impacts of climate change directly impacting their fishing practices. The recent reports that was released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have focused a session on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And looking into this report, you can see some specific chapters that are particularly relevant for small-scale fisheries because they look into and they emphasize the importance of the knowledge produced by local communities on the environmental change, and how local communities have adapted their livelihoods to respond to those changes. And this is really crucial to shape climate risk and the understanding and effectively managing climate risk in ongoing activities to longer term actions. Also, this report highlights the climate action that addresses historical injustices committed against marginalized groups and the importance of participation in climate change decisions. Principles of distributive justice are also highlighted. So the importance of procedural justice through transparency, inclusive participation in decision-making, ensuring that local communities and indigenous peoples are fully considered in this process. It's also important to highlight the chapter on vulnerability, resilience, and adaptive capacity as well, which shed light to the availability, the issue of availability of food, biological resources for medicinal purposes, recreational opportunities, cultural heritage, especially for fishing-dependent local communities. And also the social institutional adaptation to ensure knowledge diversity, social inclusive policies, participation, and so on. So these are the chapters, specific chapters in this report that I found were relevant to highlights, which are matter to small-scale fishers. And here in this box on the right side, you will see some of the recommendations that are important as well, because they focus on adaptive and ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management, participatory processes, strengthening monitoring, control, and surveillance in fisheries, broadening the catch potential to other fish species so that small-scale fishers, for instance, they're not depend only on specific fish species that are impacted by climate change. Raising awareness about the latest scientific evidence regarding climate change impacts on fisheries, and developing research on fisheries adaptation to climate change, and so on. So these are some of the relevant recommendations of this report. In international law, there are two main instruments that are governing small-scale fisheries at the international level. This is the Voluntary Guidelines for Securing Sustainable Small-Scale Fisheries in the Context of Food Security and Poverty Eradication. It's a mouthful, so they're also known as the SSF Guidelines, which were adopted in 2014, and also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which was adopted in 2018. And these are the main international instruments relevant for small-scale fisheries. And there is a recent publication that in which, together with Professor Elisa Marguera, we analyze these two instruments and we compare them in respect of how they were developed, the process of their development, as well as with respect to their content and the relevant provisions on natural resource management, traditional knowledge, and procedural rights. So it's important to note that each of these instruments, they do contain specific provisions on climate change. So the SSF guidelines contain an entire chapter dedicated to climate change and disaster risk, which is chapter 9. And there are recommendations to states and non-state actors to develop policies and plans to address climate change with full and effective consultation with fishing communities. That's very important to know. And they also recognize integrated and holistic approaches, including cross-sectoral collaboration to address climate change. So the importance of ensuring that there is this collaboration among these different sectors, given that climate change impacts fisheries, but also other sectors that relate to fisheries. So it's important to have this cross-sectoral collaboration, and also to ensure rehabilitation and reconstruction and recovery of these species and ecosystems that are affected, and to reduce vulnerabilities to potential future threats, and make available to small-scale fishing communities transparent access to adaptation funds. So many countries have already in place climate change funds, specific funds to support climate change initiatives. And this is important that it's transparent, so small-scale fishing communities have access to it. Now, the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, in turn, they focus on the rights holders. So they affirm the human rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas. And Article 1 explicitly clarifies that this declaration applies to small-scale fishing, small-scale fishers and small-scale fishing communities in rural areas. And they affirm their rights to contribute to the design and implementation of national and local climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, as well as to adequate training suited to specific effects of climate change and weather-related events. So finally, some of the findings that I would like to highlight is that this is another publication that I participated in, where we sort of examine several countries' legal frameworks, and we identify the relevant provisions for the SSF guidelines. But here we identify that climate change laws and policies do not often explicitly mention fisheries, and rarely small-scale fisheries, but that does not mean that they do not apply to this sector. So they should be, there should be sort of an interpretative, they should be interpreted as and applied to this sector accordingly. And in small-scale fisheries, they are normally referred to along with coastal and or vulnerable and or local and or traditional communities. So they're even though there's no explicit mention of small-scale fishing, they are incorporated by these terms of coastal, vulnerable, local, and traditional communities. So there are very few fisheries policies addressing climate change. And there's also another important important thing to take into account is that the small-scale fisheries guidelines, which contain this chapter 9 on climate change, has also been generating lawmaking effect at various levels of governance. So important to look at also at the regional and national policies that may have important provisions on climate change. So as a way forward, this is the last slide, and I just wanted to highlight the importance of advancing the human rights-based approach in the small-scale fishery sector. So that it's possible to effectively address climate change and avoid and tackle the impacts on small-scale fishers. And these human rights includes the right to life, property, tenure, culture, which are all threatened by climate-related disasters. The right to adequate food, which is threatened in particular by the decrease in the availability of fish stocks. The right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which is threatened by ocean warming, acidification, and decrease in ecosystem services. Thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Julia, for the, I think it's very holistic insight on the how international law actually mention about small-scale fisheries and climate change. Actually, yeah, I mean, at the implementation at the local level, we don't have climate change law in Indonesia itself. We don't have specific climate change law, and then in the implementation, the small scale fisher and then the villager, which is small scale fisher, sometimes they suffer from the sea level rise threat, and then they don't have, I mean, there's no specific law which is they can have a specific adaptation fund which is affected by climate change. So it just really, they consider it as disaster, normal disaster. And under the disaster law, this repeated flooding and then sea level rise, it is not covered by this law. So I think it is timely that we should have climate change law which address this kind of injustice to the small scale fisher. They really suffer from the changes of the environment, but the law itself does not really cover this kind of event. So thank you again for your insight. I mean, how the sustainable fisheries guidelines already cover this protection of the small scale fisher. The next speaker, I will invite Dr. Sanya Fabrica. The time is yours.
Thank you very much, Laili. I will do a joint presentations with her son, and I will share my screen now. Okay, I hope you can view my screen, okay? My name is Sanya Fabrica. I'm Knowledge Exchange Associate at University of Strathclyde, the One Ocean Hub, and I'm also an honorary senior researcher at American Study Center, Universitas Indonesia. So this presentation is based on a joint research that I carry out in collaboration with Herson Kerajaan and colleague at the Universitas Halmahera. The research itself is still at initial stage. We only start our data analysis. The research focuses on two areas in North Molucas, Tobelo and Morotai. So North Molucas is an Indonesia border region. It's located in northern part of Indonesia. It's facing the Pacific Ocean. It's located close to Palau. The province itself consists of over 1,400 islands, and only less than 10% of these islands are inhabited. The majority of fishers in North Molucas, they are can be categorized as small scale or artisanal fishers. In fact, in Indonesia, it's around 85% to 95% of fishers are small scale fishers. It is predicted that around 80% of the small scale fishers are still living under poverty line. So our joint study focused on investigating fisher perception of risk, including risk posed by climate change. So today's presentation is aimed to share our initial findings. For our study, we surveyed 300 fishers who are working in Tobelo and Morotai, and we found that the majority of them recognize risk posed by climate change to their work, to their food security, and their livelihood. Over 50% of them categorize the risk to be very high, and more than 40% of respondents claim that the climate change poses high risk to their livelihood and their real well-being. In terms of the climate change conditions that pose great risk to their well-being, more than 90% of small-scale fishers identify that storm, and cyclone, hurricanes that pose the most immediate dangers, and they are associated as the immediate impact of climate change. There are also other events such as sea level rise, where 5% of respondents identify that as immediate risk to them, and less than 1% of respondents noted flooding and seawall beach erosion as the main impact of climate change that they felt. So we find that this finding itself is interesting because climate change, as we know, is a global phenomenon, it's widely discussed, but we can see here that the impact is felt directly at the local level by small-scale fishers. So those who are most dependent on oceans, they are very vulnerable to climate change, but at the same time, they are marginalized from decision-making process related to oceans or climate change, both at local level, national or international level. We asked small-scale fishers about their knowledge on climate risk and any initiatives related to adaptation, mitigations, or effort to improve their resilience. And the finding that we got show that the small-scale fishers, they often experience lack of access to information related to ocean climate risk, or any efforts carried out by various stakeholders, either government, civil society organizations, to improve resilience, adaptations, or mitigation to climate change. A very high percentage, the majority of them, 78% of small-scale fishers claim that they are either rarely or never heard at all information on climate change risks, adaptations, and ways to mitigate this risk. And when they receive some information on climate change risk, adaptation and mitigation efforts, over 96% of respondents answered that they received this information from television rather than from stakeholders such as government, NGOs, or from experts and academics in this field. So we look at that the degree of trust on ocean climate information that the small-scale fishers receive also vary depending on the stakeholders who convey this information. So despite the lack of information provided by the government on climate risk, effort to improve resilience, adaptation, and mitigation, through this survey that we carried out, we found that the majority of respondents, they still have some degree of trust on what the government, the civil society organization, academic, and media say about climate risk and effort to mitigate this risk. The degree of trust provided by different stakeholders vary. For instance, only 19% of our respondents claim that they really trust what the government say. The survey results show that there is a high degree of trust and towards other stakeholders such as civil society organization, where over 34% of respondents claim that they have high degree of trust on what the civil society organizations say about climate change risk and ways to improve their resilience, adaptations, and also to mitigate climate change risk. In comparison, over 40% of respondents claim that they trust what the academic and also the media say about climate change risk and effort to mitigate risk. So this shows that there is actually an opportunities for different stakeholders to increase the capacity of small-scale fishers, to improve their understanding on climate risk and also on climate change adaptations and mitigation effort. And at the same time, because there is a quite significant degree of trust there from the small scale fishers, there is an opportunity for different stakeholders to learn from small scale fisher on how these different risks, different climate change risks are perceived at local level by small scale fisher, and how small scale fishers can be equipped to improve their resilience to climate change risk. We learned that in 2019, the Indonesian government, the Ministry of Fisheries, they has launched fisheries insurance. It's called the Kusuka insurance scheme. And in Morotai, we found that the level of fishers' participation in this insurance scheme is high. As of July 2020, from 3,756 fishers, over 63% of them have joined the government insurance scheme. So it's quite significant. It's around 2,324% has joined. And from the survey that we carry out both in Tobelo and Morotai, the majority of small-scale fishers, so 60% of them, claim that they have confidence that the government fisheries insurance can give them protections against loss and damage caused by accident or extreme climate impact. While this could be deemed as a progress on its own, we also found that less than 40% of respondents deemed that the process to participate in the fisheries insurance as very easy. So there are over 20% of small-scale fishers that we interview. They say that the process is actually difficult for them to get into this scheme or not very easy. The other questions that we ask the small-scale fishers is how easy for them to access financial resources, such as loan, for example, if they experience an extreme events due to climate change that cause substantial loss or damage to them. And the result was really striking because as close to 99% of the respondents say that it's not easy or it's difficult for them to access loan or other financial resources when such incident took place. And so in the next part of the presentation, my colleague Harrison Kerajaan will explain the personal factors and contextual factors that inform small-scale fishers' perceptions of risk. So Harrison, the time is yours. Harrison?
Ya, Bu Senia. Thanks for the invitation for me. And thank you to my friend Bu Senia for opportunity. I'm very grateful the event organizer and also the participant who can join this event. Next, I will present personal factor. As many as 54 of respondents stated that they had directly experienced dangerous and detrimental events in their work as a fisherman. And the majority of these respondents stated that the dangerous things works, accidents, 15.7%, and storms, 41%. Next slide. Well, contextual factors. Based on contextual factors, it showed that the majority of respondents have income of 1 million to 4 million every month. 57% were there are still respondents who do not have their own house. with the average age of the last child being 0 to 5 years old and 6 to 12 years. Next slide, Bu Sanya. For the variable risk perception, the majority of respondents said that in their profession as fishermen, there must be large potential risk, 44%, and the greatest potential is worse accidents, 51%, and storm that occur in the oceans. Thank you, Bu Sania.
Okay, thank you, Pak Herson and Mbak Senia for presenting your finding in your research. Now we move on to the next agenda, question and answer. But probably before I open the floor to give a question, I want to ask Julia regarding the international law. According to your research, do you think that the current voluntary guidelines for scoring sustainable small-scale fisher and then other UN declaration, which is not binding, it's adequate at international law level that countries can adopt at national or domestic law to have this protecting of small-scale fisher against the climate change impact. I mean, do you think we need more binding agreement, or this is this non-binding is already contain the protection of small-scale fisher against climate change? Probably that's my question.
Thank you, Lenny. Am I pronouncing your name right? I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
right.
Lenny? Yeah. Okay. So this is something that I actually the normative significance of the small-scale fisheries guidelines is something that I explore in an article, and one of the reasons why I argue that the small-scale fisheries guidelines, even though it's a non-binding and voluntary instrument, does have a normative significance. It's because of its potential to generate lawmaking effects at various levels of governance. So the small-scale fisheries guidelines are voluntary, but states, they have first of all, they have endorsed it by consensus. So there has been no opposition to the adoption of these instruments, which have strengthened its authority and recognition as an important guidance for states and non-state actors. And at the regional level, there has been some important lawmaking, let's say, that followed the SSF guidelines. So, for instance, and of course, every region will have its own particularities, and it could be that not the full guidelines are reflected in the policies that are adopted, but at least they are considered, and of course the region will adapt and will apply the guidelines accordingly. So the South in the Pacific, for instance, in the South Pacific community adopted the Numea strategy, the new song, which you may have heard of, but it's a very important instrument that also addresses climate change. And because, for the region, climate change impacts the coastal communities through sea level rise and other related impacts. So there is some sort of the guidelines, even though they're not non-binding, they have already been sort of incorporated in the region as such. There also the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean also has adopted their regional plan of action to implement the small scale fisheries guidelines. So as I said, this small scale fisheries guidance contains this chapter 9 on climate change and disaster risk. So by implementing this regional plan of action, they will also incorporate the climate change aspects of it. And there are a few countries that have already also enacted laws. And the example that we all know about is Costa Rica, because they have really enacted a decree and where in which they identify the institutions that are responsible to implement the SSF guidelines. So that was a very important progress of the implementation of the SSF guidelines at the national level. But other countries will not have this specific law implementing the SSF guidelines, but will sort of incorporate it into the Fisheries Act. So that's the case of Cabo Verde, for instance, which in their fisheries law. And so I think there is potential to rely on the SSF guidelines as a you know and have this interpretive guidance text to inform new laws and policies, or a review of existing laws and policies to address climate change. There may not be the need specifically to have a specific law on that, but if you can use existing laws and just interpret it to better implement them in the context of climate change and small scale fisheries.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. So I would like to open if the floor have some question to the speaker, to the three speaker. Please, you can raise your hand or just I can translate in English if you want to ask in Bahasa Indonesia. That would be fine also. Any question? Heru, probably you want to share your experience on climate change adaptation projects in Indonesia, and then the relation to the small scale fisher. Siapa namanya? Mbak Vera, do you have any question? Maybe you can share your experience on a gender, and then how this they impact on probably their climate change. Is there any issue on climate change or anything else?
Maybe I think Miss Ali, I think Miss Julia raised her hand.
Oh yeah. Okay, Julia.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, unless anyone else wants to speak, because I had a question for Sanya and other colleagues too on their presentation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mbak Vera?
Okay, fine. Maybe I want to share about my previous research. My previous research 3 years. Yes, in these 3 years, our team research about vocational education. Vocational education, especially in the coastal, and then there are four province, west, south of Sulawesi, and then north Sumatra, so central Java, and then central Java, and then I'm forget. So in this year, we have some findings that what Miss Senia said before, like Kusuka ya, Kusuka card. It is in Ambon or Maluku, it is quite easy to get Kusuka because it is about insurance. But my findings in Sorong or Waisai, the insurance for fishermen, it from Jasindo, yeah, it's about insurance especially for the fishermen. That's maybe not as difficult as North Maluku. Anyway, I ever been go to Jailolo, west of Halmahera, but I never been. I have never been go to Morotai. Morotai, I think, is a beautiful island. Yeah, there are a lot of coastal women also, and then but in my research, we have some findings that many women, many coastal women doesn't get about the training how to empower them, how to get income to help in household. And then this year we have a research about the how to empower them through ICT. And then we discuss and then we talk about the marketplace, how to sell the product from the Balin, maybe you can translate produk olahan ikan. Yes, they can,
Post product.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Post harvesting product of
They
fish.
can sell from Shopee, some marketplace like Indonesia, we can call Shopee or Tokopedia, maybe in like Amazon, maybe. Yeah, this is my findings that the training or the educational, the informal education for the woman, the coastal woman is not as good as for the fishermen of women. Yeah, that is my findings, Mbak Belly. Okay, maybe maybe Pak
Oh,
Heru will,
okay.
will.
Thank you, Vera. Actually, I have a question to Mbak Sanya. Do you think with the insurance, and then with the existing government policy instrument, do you think it is adequate to help the small scale fisher respond to the climate change impact, or does it like it is not really adequate? I didn't follow up the progress. I mean, how is the government policy on small scale fisher? Probably we have the regulation which is mentioned about this protection of small scale fisher, but I really don't know how is the implementation of this law actually, whether this one is effective, or what is the challenge and barrier to help to help more small scale fisher to have more better life, and then drive to food and then shelter and everything, and how the government help with this extreme event, which is probably this will have effect to the small scale fisher and also to their family. But Senia?
Yeah, thank you, Lily, for the questions. I think the insurance itself is a step in the right direction. The difficult thing in the implementation, I think there is still lack of socialization, so sharing of information to the fishers, how they can access it, especially in areas such as North Molucas. It's quite remote, it's far from Java. So there are not many civil society organizations in this area. So the scarce of information itself is a barrier for the fishers to accept it. And I think in terms of protections to small scale fishers, there are lots more to be done. So involving small scale fishers in the process, in the decision-making process. Just from our initial research, we found that the small-scale fishery itself, they can point out which are the extreme conditions that are the immediate risk for them. They have their local knowledge on the area that's affected by the erosions, by the sea level rise. So if the government can work together under civil society organization and other stakeholders, then we can develop a more like effective climate resilience adaptation measures and mitigate all these climate risks as well. And I think one of the main challenges in terms of small scale fishers and law, I would say that there are different laws in Indonesia that mentioned small scale fishers, or in Indonesia it will be nelayan kecil, which I think that on its own is also a progress that is acknowledged as small scale fishers. However, I think from one law to another, there are discrepancies. So these different law need to like speak to each other, I would say. So for example, there's law number 45 that issued in 2000 or published in 2009 that regulate about small scale fishers, and the definition are fisher who like catch the fisheries products for their daily need, and it regulates that those fishers should use vessel not larger than 5 gross tons. But then we also have other set of law that focus on the local government, the law number 23, 2014, that also defines small scale fisher in a different way, because it mentioned that small scale fishers are only those that come from like traditional fishing communities, and they have to use traditional equipment for in their activities. And it mentioned that small scale fisheries should be exempted from like fisheries license, it should be exempted from law. But then we also have another different set of law that's issue like more recent, the law number 11 in 2020, that focus more on the labor aspect of the fisheries, like it's the Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja in Indonesian language. That actually this law, it removed the limitations about the vessel capacity in the definition of small scale fishers, which it could bring negative implications toward the activities carried out by a traditional fishers or the small scale fishers that have a more clear definition on the equipment use and the vessel capacity. So yeah, I mean, this, as I mentioned, this research is still at its initial stage, so we haven't really looked into details the existing law that's being implemented at the local level, whether or not there is like local law or perda. Perhaps my colleague Herson can comment more on that aspect. Pak Herson, silakan.
Herson gimana ya? Herson, do you have any comment or thoughts on that? Mbak, nggak ada kayaknya. Is there any more question you want to ask to the speaker? Mas Gilang, on international law, probably? Yeah, please.
Ya, oke. Terima kasih, Bu Laili. I'm sorry, my English is not so good, and I will ask question in bahasa Indonesia. Please, Mrs. Laili, have to translate this. Oke. Pertama untuk Ibu Julia, apakah hukum internasional itu bisa menjadi suatu instrumen yang efektif ya, mengingat tidak semua negara itu langsung bisa mematuhi atau melaksanakan implementasi ya, langsung implementasi ke dalam negerinya, apalagi kalau yang kita tahu di Indonesia sendiri itu kedudukan hukum internasional itu juga masih belum begitu jelas ya, karena kan ada yang harus melalui transformasi ke aturan internal atau yang ada yang bisa langsung diterapkan. Jadi apakah dia akan menjadi satu instrumen yang efektif untuk melindungi para nelayan kecil kita atau small scale fisheries ini dari efek climate change. Kemudian untuk Ibu Sanya Fabrica dan Pak Herson tadi ya, kalau saya tidak salah menyimak presentasinya, saya melihat sumber informasi dari responden Anda itu yang paling banyak adalah dari televisi, dan dari government officialnya itu kecil sekali ya. Ini apakah kenapa kok dari televisi sumber informasinya, dan apakah ini suatu menunjukkan apakah ini menunjukkan bahwa isu climate change dengan small scale fisheries ini belum menjadi perhatian dari government official kita, sehingga sedikit sekali mereka memberikan informasi terkait itu. Terima kasih.
I will translate the question for Julia. I think the question is similar to my question, like how is international law effective in protecting the small-scale fisher from the impact of climate change, as this international law does not really directly translate into national law. I mean, like Indonesia probably they need to adopt it into national legislation first before it is implemented and then effective. So some of countries will not directly translate it into their domestic law. So then, do you think this kind of how to overcome this barrier? Like, do we need like against more binding, or this one, like you mentioned before, that's this non-binding is I think is enough, and is already have the effect that the countries also is a consensus that the country will directly adopt this principle at the domestic level. But in my research experience, probably the one that we still lacking to protect the small scale fisher against probably there should be that we can call it maladaptation. I really don't know if it's called maladaptation. For example, with the sea level rise impact, the government introduced the hard infrastructure, and this hard infrastructure in some cases it has a negative impact to the local fishermen. For example, there should be a relocation of the small scale fisher because of this adaptation, and then they could not doing their work anymore as a small scale fisher because they should live far away from their livelihood. So it is kind of this kind of maladaptation, or not really, there's not really clear like integrated climate change law in the domestic legislation. So there's a separate law which is not, sometimes it is not connected to each other. Sometimes it does not respond to the climate change phenomenon. So with this law laggard behind of this climate change, how you pursue that this international can really help address all this problem. I think Basania, you don't need any translation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Larry. So to answer
Julia
part.
first or Mbak Senia first to answer the question?
Sorry?
Julia or Mbak Senia?
Okay, Julia, you are welcome to answer first.
I hope you can understand me, but yeah, I think I will just reiterate what I've said, but I perhaps also giving another example that, you know, the fact that it's non-binding, it's voluntary, can also bring some advantages to the countries because they have more flexibility and the ability to look into these recommendations and apply them to what the country's, you know, needs and particular context of the country, and look into what really matters and how to apply those recommendations to the country or to the region. So for instance, and it's speaking about the region that I am more familiar with, the Secretariat of the Pacific Community have not have considered the SSF guidance as a guiding sort of recommendations to inform the policies, but they have focused more on the community-based management. So the empowerment of communities to manage the resources themselves and have this, and they're scaling up the community-based management in the region. And that helps also in addressing climate change impacts, because that empowers the community to also be able to participate in the decision making in fisheries management, look into adaptive responses to climate change. So I mean, of course it depends on states' will to implement international instruments in general. Having it as a legally binding form or not. I mean, the practical effect of it largely depends on states' will and interest in focusing on that particular area and addressing that. But I think the one of the important also important of having this as a non-binding is because it really addresses states, but also non-state actors. And this is looking into small-scale fishers as they are sheer in number, and they are really, there are many other actors that are involved in supporting small-scale fisheries. So it's important that all of them are looking into that same direction and trying to support them in addressing climate change impacts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Mbak Senia?
Yeah, thank you, lady. I want to answer Pak Sigilang first. Yes, I agree with your observations. I think there is a lack of attention on ocean climate change and small-scale fisheries from different stakeholders in the area that we study, North Molucas. There's little socializations on the government initiative in this area, or any effort to improve the small-scale fishery literacy on ocean climate nexus, for example. And I want to respond to what Lely mentioned about sometimes when there is extreme events such as sea level rise, flooding, the response is normally focus on the hard infrastructures that actually bring negative impact. So as part of the One Ocean Hub, I learned from other hub researchers that based in Ghana, for example. In this country also, the small-scale fishers experience similar situations when they experience sea level rise and the government built a protection wall on the shores. And this actually limit the fisher access to the oceans, and they have even smaller scope to fish in, because the water is categorized into areas that designated only for artisanal and for industrial fishing. So this brought negative impact to the fishers. So this similar experience that the fishers experience both in Ghana and Indonesia is because the fishers are not being consulted from the outset when when policy related to climate change are made. So we need to have a more, I think, inclusive process in developing policies and law related to climate change. Thank you.
Do you think that we need more law? I mean, the current environmental impact assessment, do you think is not adequate to help the community participate in climate change? Or do you think that we need a specific law on environmental migration, because it is like a migration, but the government does not respond to the event with the migration, because this just considered as a disaster as such. With the disaster as such, the government think that they will not help if it is repeated action. So the community should be blamed because they live in the natural disaster area. So the government will not responsible to help them continuously. So do you think we need them changing in law, or what need to be done to resolve this issue?
I think partly what you mentioned earlier provide an answer to this, because you were saying that there is no specific climate change law in Indonesia, and the existing disaster management law in Indonesia does not really recognize or cover extreme incident or events caused by climate change. So there is a need for recognitions that these are event pose immediate risk to small-scale fishers, and it needs to be acknowledged, and there's way to improve the fishers' resilience. There need to be like an umbrella law, I think, legal recognitions for this. Thank you, Larry.
Okay, thank you. Ada lagi pertanyaan kah, Pak Heru? Apakah bisa share penelitiannya tentang adaptasi? Atau silakan Pak.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, I just know about this event, and so I was late to join, and I only saw two slides, the last two slides actually. So I didn't really follow the discussion. So I'm really, really sorry. But it is also my interest to know about the current situations of whatever about the vulnerable fisher. I don't know, should we call it fisherman or the fisher person, because it's sexist. It's just talk fisherman. But anyway, I'm quite happy actually to listen that somebody only, Sanya, mentioned that some regulations that already limit the fishermen to fish because the limitation of the area for the fishing, and small-scale fisheries only close to the coastal area, so which is limit there. Actually, if they have a capacity, and actually one of to adapt in the sense of to help them to better to catch fish or something like that, and is to give technology, to provide some technology to help them, whether it's technology from from the satellites of technology for also for the weather forecast for the next 1 or 2 days, weather forecasting, something like that. And it is already mentioned by lots of people. But if the fishing area is limited because some regulation, something like that, and there's no use of that technology actually. So that's one barrier. That's, I hope laws and regulation really can uplift this kind of barrier. So I agree with Julia mentioned that what's called the community-based management, or community-based, we call it community-based adaptation in fact on adaptation. And laws and regulations is one way to enable them to survive in these conditions actually. So this is just one my answer. So I didn't really follow the whole discussion, but I really thank you for all the presentations.
Thank you, Pak Heru. Yeah, I think community-based adaptation actually it's already there, but then they usually help triggered by the NGO and then international donor to help them more empower. Like for example, in Semarang or Demak, they usually have community-based adaptation with planting mangrove, and then they also have rebuilt again the flooding area with the mangrove, so that there will be a tourism there, and then the community which is already somewhere else relocate and then coming back to this. So yeah, I think the government also should support this community-based adaptation, which is they are more like need government support, but in the end there's like the barrier is in the regulation. Like for example, the autonomy law, which is they limited the authority of regency level to have more power and authority to manage the coastal areas, because the coastal area under the regional autonomy law is now become authority of the provincial level. So it is very difficult, I think, for the regency level to have this kind of support. So, but from the provincial level also, they are like there's too many area that need to be helped with the budgeting and etc. But the money is not really sufficient for that. So it is kind of the changing of this authority from regency to provincial also creating dilemmatic in addressing this adaptation more effective at the local level. What do you think, Pak Heru?
Yeah, this is not only on the, and we talk about empower the fisheries or small-scale fisheries, then there's a lot of things involved, and mostly on the what's called the governance aspect. That's most important. What are the vision of the people, the government there, and what's to put? What are the position of the fisheries in that, and the area? How is it really the priority or not? That's if it's not the priority, then maybe other sectors are the priority, probably the agriculture or other something like that. So that's one thing, and yes, with the community-based adaptations or with it, we need their voice actually. They need to speak up and also see how they can survive. Do they have options if they have a problem, something like this? Yeah. So some regulation probably not really in their sides, not helping them, probably making them more difficult, and they need to speak up and how to something like that. So something like if their voice can be heard, and then they have a solid voice to talk to the government, and probably something like government will help. We can help probably. Hopefully that's something like all their needs, including the finance and also the management, and also somebody talk about the marketing before. So on the fish production, something like that. Yeah, and a lot of things. That's I don't know whether the priorities even though at the moment what's called the fisheries are also a priority in the development sectors, adaptations. But I don't know in real how what has been done.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Pak Heru. Is there any more thought, Mbak Sanya or Julia? Or...
Yeah, can I ask a quick question to Sanya on, I mean, your research, you've mentioned about the difficulties to access law and also the fisheries insurance scheme and so on, but I was just wondering if you're also exploring potential solutions to overcome these challenges, and whether this is, this is something that you've covered also in your empirical research, or if something that you've already identified some way forward. Thank you.
So as part of the efforts to mitigate risk, one of the aspects that's been mentioned by the fishers are to get to the government insurance scheme. That's one of the way for them. But in terms of community based one, I think most of the fisher they're not really have any association, so they haven't formed a formal association, which I think that could be part of the challenge. If they would like to have a greater inputs into decision-making process or involvement in there, and they should be more organized. So from what we gathered through interviews, they were mentioning that yes, this is how we live, and we just get on with like our daily tasks, earning money and meeting our basic needs. And if there are problems, we try to deal with it by ourselves. So that's mainly the notions that we got. But at the same time, since 2019, there have been efforts by small-scale fishers to be part of the insurance scheme. From what we learned, I think in the first years of the insurance scheme was introduced, the government was helping with the initial costs for fishers to participate in this. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. But we haven't go to the field again to see what happened at the next stage when they are not at the first year of payment for the insurance, which means the fisher have to cover the cost themselves.
Okay. Any more question before we close probably our session? Mbak Tati, tentang fishery, adakah? Atau Mbak Amel? Do you have any question to the speaker? Mbak Tati ada nggak? Pak Henry? Pak Henry biasanya nanya. Pak Henry?
Izin Bu Eli.
Nah, silakan Pak Ulang.
Maaf Bu, ini agak jauh dari pengetahuan saya, cuma dengar aja. Only hearing, Madam.
Oke, nggak apa-apa. Silakan Pak Ulang.
Oke, terima kasih Bu Eli. Pertama saya ingin secara khusus bertanya ke Ibu Yuliana Kamura, Bu, mengenai langsung saja pertanyaannya adalah apakah di Jepang itu tindak pidana illegal fishing ada? Adakah tindak pidana illegal fishing di negara Jepang? Kemudian bagaimana pemerintah negara tersebut dalam penanganan tindak pidana illegal fishing? Itu aja Bu, dua pertanyaan ini mudah-mudahan memberikan wawasan buat kita. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Paula. Julia, you want to ask you question, but this is not related to your presentation, so it is related to Japan. Like you are coming from Japan, right? No?
No, actually, I'm Brazilian, but my grandparents are Japanese.
He's from Brazilian, Pak. Dia dari Brazil, bukan dari Jepang.
No, but I understand everybody thinks I mean, because of my last name and how I look. Yeah, I'm not sorry.
I thought also you are from Japan. So his question actually related to whether there is some illegal fishing in Japan, and then whether how is the response of the government of Japan to address this illegal fishing. But if you are from Brazil, probably you can talk about Brazil. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I guess illegal fishing is a global problem, right? And it's occurring everywhere. And I wouldn't know about Japan indeed, but I mean, in Brazil, I know that also the government, with respect to institutional arrangements for fisheries and aquaculture, generally it's very limited. Well, I mean, there are many challenges to govern Brazil fisheries because of the continental dimensions of the country. It's really huge. And so it's very difficult to ensure monitoring, control, and surveillance because it is actually conducted by the environmental agency. So there's also conflicts of environmental agency with fisheries agencies, and it's very difficult to ensure to tackle illegal fishing in coastal waters, and there's also it's a dangerous activity as well, because there's a lot of also corruption in the system, unfortunately. So this is a real problem, I guess, in Brazil, because fisheries and aquaculture is not well governed in the first place. So if you know the government does not give special attention to it, and when it does, it usually the current government focus on more of the growth of the sector, so doesn't really care much, I would say, unfortunately, for the sustainability of the sector. I mean, even though it's in the law, but the practice is different. So I am sorry, Japan, I cannot really go in.
It's okay. So your research is not related to your country case study, right? So it's more like international one, and then more regional one, and then some specific countries in Pacific. So it's not related to Brazil at all. I mean, your research.
Well, I have written an article also on assessing Brazil's legal framework. So I look at more of the laws and policies of the country, not so much. I mean, the practice. I've relied on colleagues who have worked in the governments, the department of fisheries and aquaculture, to get some inputs, and I have actually written a recent book chapter on where we look into Brazil's with respect to governance of tenure, workers' rights, and gender. So that's also it's an area of study as well for me.
Okay, thank you, Sanya.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Julia asked me earlier, Mike. Although not all the fishers form like an associations, but there are a few cooperatives exist that are formed by communities, by the fishers in Tobelo and also in Morotai. So as part of these cooperatives, such as in Tobelo, they have like one called Bina Usaha, where the fishers they save some money, and if there is immediate incidents that have big impact in terms of loss and damage to them, then they can they can borrow money from the cooperatives. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's unfair for me to say earlier that not all of them, and that there is no association at all. I mean, although the majority are not part of these associations, but there are grassroots movement to address or mitigate risks that they face. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanya. Before it's closing, do you have, I mean, Sanya or Julia, do you have any closing statement, or we just do close? Cause now is 5:30, so it's almost finished our discussion. Is there any closing? No. Okay, no. Okay. Okay. Probably this is the time is up now. So thank you very much. It is our privilege to have both speaker, Mbak Sanya and then Julia, to share their research and expertise on climate change and small scale fisher. I hope this this discussion will not end from here. So if we have more research, and then probably we can do collaboration work with BRIN. We have a Rumah program. This is our budget funding, and it is open not only to the BRIN, but it is mostly, not mostly, we are really encouraged to have like a diaspora and like Mbak Sanya and then other international expert to be part of this research. So we usually open the research call for proposal in November, and then we start the research in January, and then for 1 year. And the output for this research is international publication. So I hope with this starting point of this discussion, probably we can have more brainstorming and thought how we do research on raw and then climate change fisheries, and then we can have more collaboration in the future if you are interested, because I think there is one of the specific theme is on maritime. So it's maritime is one is our priority. So if one of our researcher want to collaborate, or Mbak Sanya have some thought, maybe we can apply for one proposal to do joint research together. I think that's all. Thank you, Julia. Again, thank you, Mbak Sanya, and thank you everyone for coming and then participate in this event. And have a nice day. And thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.